So what is sociology? Most of you should have had an intro class at some point or another, but it's not always that case. So this is just a really quick overview of some of the main ideas of sociology and some of the main early philosophical leanings that led to the development of sociology. If you look over at the word cloud over here, you see the type of topics that sociologists generally discuss. In a class like social problems, we would discuss all of them, pretty much all of them. It's always surprising to students sometimes how much math is in sociology. See that statistics is up there. We will not have math in this class, but math is a big part of the research methods of it. And they didn't put medical sociology on here, but we also study the medical system and things like that. Criminal justice fits in here. A lot of people have to take sociology to go into criminal justice. So this is just a quick introduction. So depending on what textbook you used, you would have seen that sociology is either the systematic study of social interaction or the scientific study of social structure. It's actually both of these. It is the study of the interactions and the structures. The structures are the norms, the institutions, the structures, basically, kind of like the maze of life that we operate in. The interactions are the interactions that we have inside of the structure. So if you think about going to school this fall, doing this online, we are used to a very particular social structure of school. Classrooms, lectures, multiple choice tests, all that good stuff, seeing your friends, me sitting up there talking at people, being able to walk around and supervise in-class activities, the structures, what you expect the behaviors to be as you walk into a room. But because of the pandemic, all of our structures have changed. And it's the interaction that changes the structures. It's the discussions between people and among people and the decisions that are made that change the social structure. So sociology is a way of looking at the world. We look at it from a very structural component. And I really think that if you can see structure, it's like a superpower because you can really see what is guiding the behavior instead of looking at, if you think about puppetry, and you just see the puppet dance. Well, the puppet dancing is really cool, but who's controlling that puppet? The person with the strings and the boards way up on top. And structure is in some ways understanding how the strings and the boards work that influence our behavior. And then why people do what they do. We always want to know why people do what they do. Sociology studies human beings at the level of the society often. A society, it's that group of people who live within borders and cultures. It can be a community, it can be a state, it can be a country, nation state. But we tend to look beyond the individual. We're generally looking at communities of learners, something like that, some sort of societal level, group level study. Social location is the corners of life people occupy. If you think about all the different statuses we hold, if you remember what statuses are, positions in society, all of our statuses kind of add up to a social address, and you can look at somebody and understand their perspective, where they're coming from, what might form their worldview, how they might look at a particular idea, how they might think about the politics. So the type of corners of life that we occupy different inequality structures. We occupy gender structures. We occupy racial and ethnic structures. We occupy different categories of socioeconomic status and education. And it's our combination of all of these things together that will tell people kind of who we are, in a sense. It's like our social address. The micro versus macro division looks at basically the size of the group. Sometimes or structure versus interaction. Sometimes we look at the structure, the macro perspective. It's like you're on an airplane and you're looking down and you can see the suburbs and the cities and the concentric rings and everything. So it doesn't really matter who the humans are at that point. You're looking at the education as an institution. You're looking at the government. You're looking at the military. You're not caring about what it's like to be living inside of them. You're caring about how they are structured. The micro-sociology is the everyday life. What is it like to live inside of that structure? How do people interact with each other? What are their basic patterns of behavior that they have to go through? As we're watching the changes due to the pandemic, you'll see a lot of micro-sociology work. What is it like to go to school now? It's very, very different to go to school now. What are the interactions going to be? And again, it's not an individual. In sociology, we are always at a group level. So our groups can be as small as 2, very rarely, but as small as 2. But generally in micro-sociology, you're looking in a 15 to 25, give or take ratio. And then macro is going to be much more societal level. The Sociological Imagination by C. Wright Mills. This is what I want everybody to have when they leave a sociology program or a sociology class. The ability to grasp history and biography and the relations between the two. What he's trying to tell you is that history happens, right? Wars happen, natural disasters happen, people are elected, people are not elected, whatever, history happens. But you happen. And your life happens, and sometimes your life butts up against history. Things happen in history that impact you as a human being. And it's that understanding of that connection between you and history, and understanding that if you were to have lived in a totally, completely different time, you would be a different person because you would be in a different history. You would be you biologically, but you would not have gone through the experiences that you did and formed the self that you formed if you had been born in a different time. So it's that ability to see your progress and the world's progress all at the same time, and where they start interacting and bumping into each other. And now just a little bit about our founders, the old dead dudes of sociology. We're going to cover just a few of them to kind of give you an idea of the early philosophers and sociologists and how they viewed the world. And then we'll transition out of this presentation and then into the individual, what are they? The individual perspective ones. Everybody's favorite, Auguste Comte. If you've never heard of Auguste Comte before, you better remember him because he is the founder of sociology. So if you have to take that sociology praxis test or whatever it is at the end of your school journey, you are probably going to have to remember Auguste Comte. So he came up with the name sociology. That's what he's most known for. The ideas of sociology were floating around, but Comte said, let's call it this. The other thing Comte is famous for is using scientific observation when looking at social behavior. We can use science and look at people. You can't, it's not just looking for rocks, the other things we were looking at scientifically, physical objects and biology, cutting them up and seeing the different parts. But you can actually look at how society works here as well. And then social statics, which is the study of social stability, because there are some things that stay stable in society from the beginning of time. There have been some kind of family since the beginning of humans. Humans have divided each other into categories from pretty much the beginning of time. So we look at social stability and order. How does society stay stable? But we also understand that society changes all the time, like really fast changes. So we have to understand both of these, social statics, social dynamics, at the same time. What ended up happening in the field of sociology is that the social statics people kind of went in the functionalist direction, the order and stability direction. And the social dynamics people were some of the early conflict theorists. So there was the split there. The other thing I forgot to say on the founding chart is that sociology developed in part due to the Industrial Revolution. That was a major historical paradigm change. People left the farms, the feudal system was over, the agricultural system was over. People were moving to cities, cities were becoming more dense, and everybody kind of thought the world was going to hell in a handbasket, as people tend to do whenever there's big changes, socially speaking. And they wanted to understand how this new world was going to work. And sociology arose out of that confusion. So maybe sociology can rise again out of the pandemic, right? We can figure out how society works. Herbert Spencer, everybody's least favorite. He is a British theorist, and if you think about this first paragraph, you're going to see this in functionalism. He's compared society to biology, just like a human body. Society has interrelated parts working together that keep it alive. So does society have all of these parts? Now, where sociology and Herbert Spencer kind of draw the divide, or at least American sociology really divides with Herbert Spencer, is his social Darwinism, because he believed in evolutionary social change. If society has all of these many parts that are working together to promote its well-being and survival, then you leave it alone, right? Remember survival of the fittest with the animals? You don't go in there and mess with the animals. The ones who are meant to die will die, and the strongest will survive, and that's what we want to have happen. He really looked at that from a societal level. The poor deserve to be poor, the rich deserve to be rich. You do not mess with society. If you have babies dying in ditches someplace, well, that's just the price you pay for having a society. And if you let the babies die in the ditches, eventually you will get yourself moved to a much better society. You can tell I'm not a social Darwinist, right? So he's kind of hoping that this evolution would happen. Americans are bad at this. Americans want to meddle in everything. So we are the ones who created programs. Heck, we created social work, right? So Herbert Spencer, we take his first paragraph and we like it a lot, but his second paragraph here, we really staunchly disagree with, especially in American sociology. And you cannot talk about sociology without our good old friend Karl Marx, right? Karl Marx was the two-class system, the owners of the means of production and everybody else. And the owners of the means of production don't have to work. They survive on the labor of others. And that society has class conflict, always has had, ever since the first hunters and gatherers started not being hunters and gatherers and started horticulture so that they could put some wheat in a barn. As soon as you could have a surplus, then you had a class system, according to Karl Marx. So the beginning of surplus was basically the downfall of humanity. So now you have this conflict between those controlling the means of production and those laboring. In our society, we're not really an industrial factory system like Karl Marx, so it's a little bit harder to imagine the owners of the means of production. We tend to think that they might be small business owners, but they're not small business owners. They would be like the boards of directors of major multinational corporations. That's who are the owners of the means of production. They're the ones that actually are invested in the stock market, and they're the ones who live on stock options and dividends and fun stuff like that. So we don't have physical manifestation like the factory owners and workers anymore, but we still do have that split. And Karl Marx, of course, advocated revolution, and people kind of throw his ideas out with bathwater, but he was a great critic of capitalism. So if you ever get a chance to look up some Karl Marx, look him up and read his criticisms. So Durkheim is another one of our early social theorists. He is looking at the transition in society between the agricultural system and the industrial system. And he's trying to figure out, basically, how are we not just killing everybody? Basically, how do we get along and survive our everyday lives when we don't know people? So he kind of imagines in his head a 1400s French village. If you are growing up in this 1400s French village, you are pre-industrial mechanical society, you know everybody, right? And you have known people since you were born. Anybody born after you, you have known them since they were born. Everybody is the same religion. Everybody does mostly the same stuff. Everybody has gruel for breakfast, that kind of thing. You have shared lives, basically, is what Durkheim is getting at. And you don't really have to think about your future. If you are a male in one of these societies and your father is a sheep herder, and his father before him was a sheep herder, and his father before him, well, guess what you're going to be when you grow up? You're not going to be a mechanical engineer, right? You're going to be a sheep herder. So pre-industrial society, he looks at it as shared, and he looks at it as you really don't have to make a lot of decisions. The decisions are made for you. There's a lot of structure, and you live within this shared, very formed structures. This organic solidarity happens when the factories are built and people get kicked off the land because the royal or the nobles and everything aren't making money anymore, and they'd rather live a beautiful view than have farms. Or in the case of Scotland, they'd rather have sheep than tenants. So people are moving to the cities, to the factory jobs, so that they can live. So now they're living in tenements, and they're living packed on top of each other, and they don't know who each other is. They may have different religions. They might be coming from different regions of the country. And he wants to know what's the glue that's going to hold society together now. In the pre-industrial society, that glue was that shared structures. In industrial society, though, it's the shared interaction. It's the consensus that we have, that if I go to the grocery store or something like that and just live my everyday life, I may not know the people that I'm interacting with, but in some sense, I value their position and what they bring to society. They serve a valued role, basically. It's not a good way of saying that, but you might need them someday, right? So you don't just randomly kill people or hole up in your apartment forever. You go out and you interact in society, but you interact in a positional type of way rather than a shared type of way. You interact as human and grocery checker instead of interacting as human beings that have known each other since the moment of birth. So it's more of a needs-based type of interaction and consensus on all of us agreeing what those positions are. And then you can blame him for statistics also. If you are not a fan of statistics, he is the one that said you can turn social data into mathematical data. You can do math with people. So yeah, you can stick a pin in him because he is the reason why we have statistics. Max Weber, you might remember the iron cage of bureaucracy, rationalization, his disagreements with Marx on whether social class is more than just income, his idea that it's power and prestige as well as money. And then the big things for research methods in Max Weber was his idea of putting yourself in the place of others and that objective research that requires you to do that. You lose your own biases and your own ideas about how the world works from your opinions about how the world works. Instead, you try to put yourself into the places and positions and ideas and feelings of those people that you are studying. You listen to them, you watch them, you gather a whole bunch of information from them, you give them surveys. Whatever it is, however you're gathering that information, you are allowing the people that you're studying to speak for themselves and the data that you collect to speak for itself, instead of telling the story that you want to tell. That's really difficult sometimes, but that's the way that we are to do research methodology in sociology. We are to be always. Last but not least, the American sociologists. American sociology is university-based. If you think about Max Weber and Durkheim and Comte and Marx and many of the early sociologists, they were either independently wealthy or they were sponsored. European thought and early sociology and philosophy and art and music and everything came from a sponsorship system. America was different. Our early sociology came from the university system, and the University of Chicago is our center, really. It was the first big department, and a lot of our really big names and first American theorists came from there. And it had a big focus on social reform. So here we are already disagreeing with Herbert Spencer, and we just got started in America. So we want to reform people. Some of our early guys, Talcott Parsons, if you're in the medical sociology class, you will hear a lot about him. You will not be able to escape him. Jane Addams is an incredible woman in Chicago who most definitely was a meddler in society. She was also very anti-Herbert Spencer, and she's the founder of social work. She was an early sociologist. W.E.B. Du Bois, one of our first African-American PhDs. Lots of different disciplines claim him, but sociology says he's ours too. And he looked at what they called back in the day, in quotes, the Negro problem. What is it like? And he was really good at that whole idea of embodiment and that whole idea of intersectionalism, I guess is what they're calling it now. When you belong to two groups, and those two groups are looked at by the world in a different way. He talks about what it is like as a black male to be male, which is the dominant group, but yet to be black, which is the subordinate group, at his time especially. And what that embodiment of both of those things meant to him. So he was kind of our first intersectionality guy, embodiment. Of course, he worked for civil rights. We would expect that. But what I didn't realize when I first learned about W.E.B. Du Bois is what an incredible data visualization whiz that he was. Look up the 1900 Paris World's Fair, because people in Paris were fascinated by the African-American experience in America after the Civil War. So W.E.B. Du Bois and some of his students made a whole bunch of these beautiful hand-drawn visualizations to depict what life was like in the late 1800s. So if you're interested in any kind of data collection, data processing, visualizations, these are like the first infographics of their time. So check that out. We can blame infographics on W.E.B. Du Bois. We won't blame that on him, but we will claim him as a sociologist for sure. And last but not least, the transition into the sociological perspectives. So sociology had all of these ideas and authors and philosophies and everything kind of floating about. And into the early 1900s, as a university system and sociology as a discipline became a little bit more firm in the US and in the world, early sociologists began to kind of pile up the different ideas. And going back to Auguste Comte with his statics and dynamics, we ended up with functionalism as our first theory. We ended up with conflict theory as our reactionary theory, symbolic interactionism. And then in modern theory, we have postmodernism, which is roughly late 60s to about 2005, maybe a little bit earlier than 2005. And then what the heck is now? And then what the heck is really now? I should put that down there, because we're probably transitioning out of whatever followed postmodernism. We've probably got a number 3 down under here that we are just beginning to grapple with as the pandemic has wreaked its havoc across the United States. So I have different videos so you don't have to listen to me for hours and hours. I have a functionalism review, a conflict theory review, a symbolic interactionism review, and then one on modern theory.